Join the Comgiverse Patreon for exclusive content, behind-the-scenes access, and special perks. Support the channel and connect with a community of revolutionary intellectuals and scholars. Click the link in the description to join now.
News flash, you're in Africa and Africa is the black land, so you're black. There are so many different indigenous groups of people in Africa that are so unique and so different from each other. Some of them are lighter skinned, like the ones in the North Africa. All of North Africans can agree on this. We do not deny our Africanness. We consider ourselves just as African as the Africans in the west and the center of Africa. And do you even know how large Africa is? Let me just tell you how large Africa is. The distance between Central Africa and Egypt is the same distance between Egypt and Oslo in Norway.
The rise in violence against black people in Tunisia has raised concerns among activists. They believe Tunisian President Kais Saied's February speech, warning of demographic change and targeting foreigners, has fueled the hatred. In recent months, migrants and native blacks have been attacked. A 2018 law criminalizing racism has been largely ineffective, yet many people are calling for its repeal. Huda Ziodet, a black Tunisian now living in Canada, says racism has become more pronounced in Tunisia. After Said's speech, blacks from sub-Saharan Africa were repatriated and evicted from their homes. According to anti-racism group NEMTI, about 10 to 15% of Tunisia's population is black.
Skin color.
I remember my grandmother saying to me, I don't care what they tell you in school, Cleopatra was black.
Mangbetu people have swollen heads through binding and look similar to the heads of Amana statues. Is there a connection between the two? This is a question about head binding and cranial deformation. And if you look in different societies all over the world, you'll see different variations of this. When the question is asked, is there a connection between the two? We have to ask ourselves, connection in what way? Is there a common set of cultural values or aesthetics that value this? How widespread would one want to see a custom or a trait before one wanted to say there was some common cultural basis? When you look at the implements, the stone tools and the pottery from the western desert of Egypt, that date to between, say, the 8 and 6,000 BC period, before you have pre-dynastic Egypt. When you look at these things, and then you look at the pre-dynastic toolkits and the pottery, there's no question that people moved in out of the Sahara Desert into the Nile Valley. There's no question that there's a commonality. Did those Saharan people move anyplace else? Do we have any evidence? Yes, we have some evidence that things that they manipulated became incorporated in other places. And so ideas do travel. Sometimes they travel complete and intact, and sometimes they don't. I can't comment whether this sort of singular custom amongst this particular group of people has anything to do with Armana specifically. If it had been the case that throughout all of Egyptian history, people had been, binding their heads and creating this, I might be more prone to say that, yeah, well, maybe there's some deep-rooted idea that survived in different places. Maybe it goes back to the Sahara. I don't have that kind of evidence. So my tendency would be to say that no, the specific practices at Armana, specifically at Armana, are probably not connected to these. Some people have said that the mummies from the Valley of the Kings have similar facial features to the Masai Mora. Is this true, and where are the mummies now? In general, I would make the argument that many of the mummies from Egypt and Upper Egypt have a general set of facial characteristics which can be called elongated African. They are Somali-like. They are they come from because they're descendants of people from a hot, dry climate. They have this sort of elongated face that one sees in some living Africans. One can also note that the limb ratios, the limb proportions of Egyptians are tropical. They have a tropical body plan. They do not have a Northern European body plan or a Siberian body plan. They do have a tropical body plan. Generally, you see people with narrow faces and noses in Africa in the circum-Saharan regions or in the Sahara, bordering the Sahara. That's generally where you see them. In the deep forest belt, you see people with other kinds of physical traits. They tend to have a broader face.
The study of human genetics, while a beacon of scientific progress, has long been shadowed by its exploitation as a tool of racial subjugation and cultural erasure. From the pseudoscientific race theories of the 19th century to modern-day genomic analyses, the manipulation of genetic data has been weaponized to legitimize racism, undermine Black humanity, and strip African civilizations of their rightful legacy. This practice persists in subtle yet insidious forms. Statistical methodologies, ostensibly neutral, are contorted to resurrect colonial narratives, while sampling biases and analytical oversights reinforce the myth of a racially hierarchical world order. A recent study by Salem et al. Controversially claims that ancient green Saharan populations thriving during the African humid period received no genetic contribution from populations south of the Sahara. This assertion, however, collapses under scrutiny, revealing not only methodological flaws, but also the inherent contradictions within Western academic frameworks that seek to rigidly define African history. On one hand, mainstream scholarship has long argued that modern West and Central Africans descend from Saharan herders, who migrated southward as the Sahara dried approximately 5,000 years ago. This model, promoted by Africanist linguists, even posits that these populations spoke a hypothetical Niger-Saharan macro-language family, purportedly linking Ibero-Maurusian cultures of North Africa to later sub-Saharan groups. Yet Salem et al.'s study, by denying any infra-Saharan genetic influence on green Saharans, inadvertently undermines this very narrative, exposing a paradox. Western scholarship simultaneously insists on the Sahara as both a bridge for migrations to explain sub-Saharan diversity, and a barrier to isolate North Africa as a non-African space. The study's central methodological failing lies in its misuse of F4 statistics, a tool designed to measure genetic drift between populations. By structuring the function as F4 chimpanzee, Zalacha ku African, Takarkori, the authors combined a broad African category with the specific ancient Saharan group, Takarkor, on the same side of the semicolon, thereby obscuring whether Takarkor shares closer ties to African lineages or to early Eurasians represented by Zlataku. More appropriate setup would reorient the function as F for chimpanzee, Takakori, African Zlachaku, which places Takakori as the test population on the left side, allowing for a direct comparison of its allele sharing with Africans versus early Eurasians. In this configuration, a negative z-score would indicate that Takarkor is closer to Zlataku, while a positive score would imply a closer relationship to Africans. This restructured test would clarify the genetic affinities by avoiding the mixing of populations with potentially different levels of genetic drift. Additionally, the study's reliance on ghost populations such as the ill-defined ancestral North African ANA group further compounds the issues, as ANA lacks clear genetic distinction from sub-Saharan Africans, and thus becomes a statistical mirage that inflates the perceived uniqueness of North African ancestry while erasing the evidence of sustained interactions between Saharan and sub-Saharan populations. These methodological errors have not remained confined to technical discussions. They have been weaponized to bolster racial pseudoscience, historical racial myths, including the discredited Hamitic hypothesis and narratives of an invading pharaonic race, resurface in genetic studies that misinterpret allele sharing or genetic drift. By misclassifying genetic markers or misinterpreting drift signals, such as the disproportionate allele sharing in admixed population studies, have sometimes suggested that ancient North African groups
occupied a genetic intermediate status. Such claims not only skew our understanding of migration and population continuity, but also serve to downplay the indigenous contributions of African populations, reinforcing outdated ideas of racial superiority and external influence. The debate extends into the realm of historical populations such as ancient Kemet. Dr. Shamarka Kaita Etiezau's critiques of studies like Schunemann Etiezau's analysis of northern Egyptian mummies have shown that sampling bias, focusing solely on northern locales with strong Near Eastern influences, yields a skewed representation of Kemet's genetic diversity. By neglecting the southern regions, where indigenous African heritage is more pronounced, genetic studies risk mischaracterizing the true population structure. Such biases, coupled with the misclassification of mitochondrial haplogroups, for instance, labeling certain African-specific clades, like mtDNA M1, as Asian, inadvertently support narratives that divorce ancient Kemet from its African context, feeding into colonial Lyra stereotypes about African inferiority and the illegitimacy of indigenous contributions to civilization. Both Tishkoff's study of African population structure and Koyo et.al.'s research on the Bantu language expansion attempt to use genetic data to validate large-scale historical and linguistic narratives. But this approach is problematic when viewed alongside historical linguistic critiques of the mass comparison method commonly employed by some Africanist scholars. Critics of mass comparison argue that by comparing large numbers of lexical items across languages, researchers often propose macro groupings such as Niger-Congo or Afroasiatic without adequately accounting for systematic sound correspondences, leaving these linguistic phyla hypothetical and disputed due to the high risk of chance resemblances, borrowing, or aerial diffusion rather than true genetic inheritance. Using genetic clustering techniques such as PCA to confirm these disputed linguistic classifications is fundamentally flawed because genetics, which reflect biological ancestry through processes like mutation, drift, and migration, evolve under different dynamics than language, which is shaped by sound change, reanalysis, and extensive borrowing. When Tishkoff's work interprets genetic clusters generated from Bayesian clustering and structure analysis as distinct ancestral lineages aligning with language families, it risks over-interpreting the data. PCA outcomes are extremely sensitive to sample composition, taxon inclusion, and even decisions regarding which principal components to display. With uneven sample sizes, for instance, when African datasets are compared against Eurasian groups, potentially generating visually compelling yet artifactual clusters, the interpretation of genetic data in studies of African population history requires careful methodological scrutiny, as analytical approaches often risk conflating modern demographic patterns with ancient evolutionary processes. Tishkoff, ETA. LS 2009. Structure analysis, while pioneering in its scope, exemplifies these challenges. By partitioning genetic diversity into K equals 14 clusters labeled with linguistic or ethnic identifiers. For example, Cushitic speaking, the framework risks oversimplifying Africa's complex genetic landscape, where isolation bidistance and continuous gene flow have shaped gradual clinal variation. The assumption of discrete ancestry components may misrepresent recent demographic events, such as genetic drift in small, bottlenecked populations, for example, the Mbagu, or admixture in groups like the Bagara signals of ancient divergence. Moreover, structures' inability to disentangle true ancestry from genetic drift or environmental adaptation, for example, disease resistance alleles, could artificially inflate differences between subgroups, such as East versus West Bantu populations. These issues are compounded by circular reasoning, Linguistic or archaeological data are often used to validate genetic clusters without independent verification, potentially conflating language spread with deep population history. Such methodological limitations underscore the necessity of integrating complementary approaches like F-statistics or bad mixture to differentiate recent demographic noise from ancestral structure. These concerns extend to principal component analysis, PCA, a method similarly vulnerable to sampling biases and artifactual clustering. A hypothetical expansion of Tishkov's dataset to include underrepresented groups such as Central African hunter-gatherers, aka Twa Omotic-speaking populations, Woleta, and Ubangian-speaking communities, Zandi, would likely expose critical flaws in PCA's sensitivity to uneven sampling. For instance, adding robust samples is greater than or equal to 30 individuals per population could dissolve the apparent genetic isolation of Western pygmy clusters into clinal gradients with neighboring Bantu Ubangian groups, challenging assumptions of long-term pygmy divergence. Similarly, incorporating Omotic populations might bridge genetic variation between so-called Cushitic and Niger-Congo speakers, shifting PCA axes to emphasize Omotic Nilo-Saharan differentiation over Eurasian admixture narratives. Even linguistic classifications prove unstable. Ubangian-speaking groups, though seen as part of the hypothetical Niger-Congo family, could fragment the Niger-Kordofanian cluster into substructures, repositioning admixed Fulani pastoralists as part of a Sahelian continuum rather than outliers. Such revisions align with critiques that PCA overstates population boundaries due to variance distortion, particularly when small sample sizes, for example, Eaton N equals 4, or regional sampling gaps amplify projection biases. To mitigate these artifacts, balanced sampling and integration of supervised methods are essential not only to validate clusters, but also to illuminate Africa's genetic continuums, where admixture gradients often undercut narratives of rigid linguistic genetic concordance. Methodological artifacts and sampling biases further complicate phylogeographic reconstructions of major demographic events, such as Coyle et al.'s proposed Bantu expansion via a rainforest route approximately 4,420 BP. While the study maps genetic affinities to support this trajectory, its reliance on cluster-based analysis akin to Tishkov's approach leaves it susceptible to conflating genetic relatedness with linguistic inheritance. Genetic similarities attributed to a shared expansion route could instead reflect localized admixture or recent migrations unrelated to ancient Bantu dispersal. This circularity is exacerbated by the use of mass comparison, a linguistic method criticized for lacking rigor to validate genetic clusters. Crucially, language spread need not align with genetic ancestry, as influential languages can disseminate across genetically disparate groups through cultural diffusion. Without disentangling these dynamics, cluster-centric analyses risk reinforcing tautological narratives, wherein genetic data are interpreted through pre-existing linguistic frameworks that themselves lack empirical robustness. Collectively, these studies highlight the pitfalls of over-reliance on single methodologies in population genetics. Whether through structure, PCA, or phylogeographic mapping, the conflation of sampling artifacts, recent admixture, and linguistic labels with deep ancestral history persists. Robust insights into Africa's complex genetic tapestry demand methodological pluralism, synthesizing allele, frequency-based tools with haplotype-aware approaches, and explicit modeling of gene flow to disentangle the intertwined legacies of ancient divergence, environmental adaptation, and millennia of human mobility. Adding to this complexity, Some scholars, such as Dr. Mubabinj Bilalo, have argued that the identities of African groups like Chaka populations were historically erased to obscure their direct connection to the ancient pharaonic civilizations. Africanists like Wilhelm Bleek and the Nazi Karl Meinhof used terms like Kafir and Bantu to refer to these populations, and according to Bilalo, obscure their identity as members of the great Ethiopian family from the ancient Hapi River basin. This is consistent with genetic patterns of markers like EV1515 from Northeast Africa and its descendants EM293 in Central and Southern Africa, which suggests the pharaonic continuum rather than the neat splits implied by simplified genetic clusters. In sum, while both Tishkoff and Coyle et al. Provide valuable genetic insights into African history, using genetic evidence to substantiate disputed linguistic phyla is intrinsically flawed. Due to methodological biases in PCA, the domain mismatch between biological and linguistic evolution, and the inherent uncertainty and circular reasoning involved in validating hypothetical macrolinguistic groupings. In contrast to these approaches, the Abing Doyopian school of historical linguistics offers an alternative framework that emphasizes indigenous African orature, cultural transmission, and systematic linguistic correspondences between ancient Egyptian and modern African languages. Central to their argument is the assertion that genetic and cultural variations among African populations reflect millennia of continuity, rather than merely recent migrations or admixture events. This perspective is anchored in robust linguistic evidence, such as the striking morphological parallels between Egyptian and Wolof. For instance, the third-person singular suffix pronouns in Egyptian .fs and Wolof .ef.es align perfectly, as do plural forms SN in Egyptian versus sen in Wolof. Similarly, the future tense particle na, Egyptian Coptic, recurs across African languages like Bambara, na, Luganda, na, and Fonke, suggesting a shared grammatical heritage rather than isolated borrowing. The school further highlights syntactic singularities, such as the negative imperative particle m in Egyptian, for example, ear, don't do, mirrored in Yoruba, ma yoko, don't sit, a feature absent in Semitic languages like Arabic, which uses la. Such idiosyncratic correspondences challenged the ghost population admixture models favored by Greenbergian scholars, instead positing deep-rooted cultural and linguistic continuity. Lexical parallels reinforce this. The Egyptian dish resonates in Mbochi daza, to eat Yoruba ji and Kikongo dia, while the word for water mw in Egyptian, ma in Coptic, persists in Mbochi, ma, Lingala, mai. Gilbert and Gomes' identification of genetic ties between Dula and the Pharaonic language exemplifies this methodology, revealing shared roots beyond superficial borrowing. These findings collectively debunk the Afroasiatic classification as a Eurocentric construct lacking empirical rigor. For instance, Berber's etch to eat starkly contrasts with the Pan-African Giadia lineage, while Egyptian kinship terms like RMT man evolve into Coptic Rome and Mbochi Olomi, illustrating a cohesive linguistic trajectory distinct from Semitic or Berber. By centering African orature and comparative linguistics, the Abingudiopian school advocates for a paradigm shift, reconstructing Africa's linguistic history through its own cultural memory rather than imposed frameworks. This approach not only reconnects the Nile Valley's legacy with broader African traditions, but also calls for methodologies that prioritize Africa's endogenous epistemologies, vital step toward decolonizing historical linguistics. Methodological overreach in genetic studies thus emerges as a central theme in Western scholarship on Africa. Whether it is the misapplication of statistical tools like F-statistics and PCA, or the uncritical alignment of genetic clusters with disputed linguistic phyla, these studies often fall into traps that yield oversimplified or misleading narratives. Sampling biases, over-reliance on explained variants, and the absence of robust complementary methodologies all contribute to the fragility of the inferences drawn. Moreover, when these flawed interpretations are overlaid onto broader cultural debates, they risk perpetuating colonial lyra constructs of racial hierarchy and cultural separation. In conclusion, the study of human history demands more than genetic snapshots, requires a lens that harmonizes science with cultural memory. Persistent flaws, from Salem ETHL, S-skewed F4 statistics, to Tishkoff's over-partitioned clusters, expose how isolated methodologies risk reviving colonial myths. Yet Africa's story resists simplification. Linguistic echoes between ancient Egyptian and Wolof grammar, genetic threads like EV1515 linking Pharaonic and Inner African populations, and oral traditions all testify to a continuum erased by Eurocentric frameworks. To dismantle these distortions, research must braid rigorous genetics with archaeology, linguistics, and indigenous epistemology. Only then can fragmented data coalesce into truths that honor humanity's interconnected roots where genes, words, and cultural legacies converge to reclaim Africa's narrative as one of enduring innovation, not imposed fracture.
Join the Comgiverse Patreon for exclusive content, behind-the-scenes access, and special perks. Support the channel and connect with a community of revolutionary intellectuals and scholars. Click the link in the description to join now.